Hello and welcome to the channel. On this channel I like to talk about a variety of negotiation concepts and themes, and regular listeners to my channel will know that I have done quite a bit of commentary on the Brexit negotiations. As a professional negotiator myself, the how Brexit was negotiated with the EU by the UK government represents a stunning example of bad practice, we would like to say. So in other words, it set the benchmarks for how not to conduct international negotiations because it was done so badly. So professional negotiators myself will use Brexit as a training tool when delivering training to students, because it has every single mistake possible that you would want to teach a student about. Now, of course, we're many years past that process now. The supposed Brexit negotiations are done and dusted. So we're now in the implementation phase of Brexit, when the UK has left the EU and is now trying to forge its own path in the world. So with that in mind, I thought it would be interesting to do a bit of a stock take as to what this had meant for the UK. Specifically, I'm trying to figure out, has the UK government learnt its lessons from its earlier mistakes, and is it now taking those lessons forward and applying them in order to deliver the goals of Brexit, whether that be Global Britain or any other fad. So for anyone new to this channel, I am the collaborative negotiator. I'm a professional negotiator of over 10 years experience. I conduct large-scale international negotiations as routine, and I like to talk about Brexit a lot, unfortunately. So let's have a look at this little topic, and let's dig in a broad sense to what Brexit means to the UK's place in the world. Now, in order to do this, I've broken this down into a variety of topics, and I will go through each one of them. So let's look at this. So we're going to talk about types of international power. We'll start with military power, and obviously, military power was perhaps supposedly not as prevalent as it used to be. It is obviously still important as to how nation states interact with each other. Talk about political power. How do nations exert influence on other institutions, other nations, the global community, to shape what they want? In a previous video, I talked about the fact that all international states operate on the basis of self-interest or enlightened self-interest, and political power is the primary tool that they use to deliver on those interests. Of course, we've also got economic power. That should not be underestimated. That is an influence all in itself. And I also briefly touch upon scientific and cultural power. Some people might call this sort of thing soft power, and it's worth a quick discussion, I would say. So focusing on military power first, the UK, of course, is a nuclear weapons state. Now, whilst that shouldn't mean anything in terms of international negotiation, it is generally perceived or argued, and hotly debated, I should add, that by being a nuclear weapon, that conveys upon the UK a certain status. Other people might legitimately argue that the UK, being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, gives it more influence in this regard. It is hard to prove this one way or another. But what is an argument for this is that when dealing with countries like North Korea or Iran, just to name two examples, they do respect, they may not like it, they may hate it, but they will respect the fact that they are dealing with an adversary that has nuclear weapons. And of course, we've seen that Russia had very recently made a very specific point of highlighting that it has nuclear weapons as a deterrent to others. So this is a means of exerting power. Does it have any relevance to Brexit? No. None whatsoever. So we'll move on. Talk about conventional forces. Now, of course, this can be in terms of numbers, it can be in terms of quality, it can be in terms of the professional standards of the forces. So now the UK military are quite an influence, I suppose, in some ways. They travel a lot, they get around a lot, they train a lot of countries, nations. So they do human rights training or enforcement training or peacekeeping training and so on and so forth. So this is one of the means by which the UK is able to exert influence internationally, by using its conventional forces to create presence. And we can see that quite a bit in Eastern Europe at the moment, where the UK, amongst many other nations, has bolstered its presence on the eastern flank of NATO. Again, this was the case before Brexit. Brexit has not actually created any particular changes here. So we'll move on. Now, defence expenditure. This is another influential factor, and it links into the conventional forces in some ways. The amount of money you spend is an influence all in itself. This is because it's not just in terms of the size of the army, but it allows you to create a lot of weapons and to create a lot of industry, shall we say, and technological know-how if you spend that money wisely. Now, the UK is one of the top tier nations in this regard. Obviously nowhere near a bigger spender at the likes of the US, but seen as in the top rank, shall we say, along with the likes of China and Russia and so on. The UK doesn't spend silly money on defence. An example of that would be Pakistan, that spent about 20% of its government expenditure on defence, which is insane, influential in all sorts of wrong ways, but not necessarily or ultimately beneficial. Now, in terms of Brexit, there's a more subtle relationship here, because this links into economic might. You can only really have viable defence expenditure if you've got a decent, economy going behind you. So in this respect, I'd say Brexit perhaps has had a more indirect, but not significant impact. Moving on to aggressive utilisation of force. And by this I mean that a country doesn't have to have massive military, possibly has at least a vaguely competent military, but uses it assertively. The US, an example of this. The French have also been examples of this. And one example of that is many years back, the French were doing peacekeeping in the Ivory Coast. The Ivory Coast government decided to be somewhat more aggressive or assertive in its posture, and the French wiped out the entirety of the Ivory Coast Air Force in one pass. That was an aggressive assertion of power in order to exert influence, which the French did very successfully on that occasion, and the US had done numerous occasions. I won't go into any of those. Again, I would hope that no one in Brexit Britain would think that deploying the UK military aggressively is a good idea in the context of Brexit. That has not happened yet. So we'll say nothing there and move on. Now, the next thing is a bit more subtle, and that is defence diplomacy. And it's very much soft power. And I've talked about conventional forces being deployed to provide reassurance to people and also to provide lots of training. And the UK has been very good at this traditionally, and the UK continues to do this. Has Brexit materially impacted on the UK's ability to conduct defence diplomacy? And by the looks of it, it has not, one way or another. So as a general theme, Brexit has had no real impact on the UK's military influence. There is one small thing that I will raise, and it's just too early to draw conclusions, and that is industrial development. Industrial development is crucial for any nation willing to have a decent military. As we've seen with events in Ukraine and Russia, having lots of very old rubbish equipment will only get you so far. And the Russians seem to be learning that the hard way at the moment, judging by what's going on over there. So countries like the UK, the whole of Europe and the US and many others know that it is essential to put a significant portion of your defence spending into maintaining a very good high-end industrial base, and they devote lots of attention to that. The UK, of course, is one of the world leaders in this regards. Now, in the short term, Brexit has not made any difference to this. But I'm going to cover this a little bit further on in the video when I talk about economic and scientific influence. Because the UK military is no longer plugged into European defence system as it was. It still is in NATO, and a lot of defence expenditure and investment is channeled in the context of NATO. But in context of Europe, and as a result of what has happened in Ukraine, Europe, led by Germany and France, is going to become considerably more assertive on the industrial development. We don't know at this point if Brexit Britain is going to lose out as a consequence of that. In other words, not secure the deals. So that is an open question at this point. But for this particular slide on military power, I'm going to draw a neutral mark on the impact of Brexit on UK's influence and power internationally. So let's talk about political power. This is where things get more heated and more interesting. I'll start by talking about institutional influence. As I mentioned, the UK is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That conveys a certain amount of influence. And that hasn't changed, perhaps. But the UK also has a presence in a whole variety of other organisations. No longer the EU, of course, but it is still members of a whole host of different international organisations. For example, the World Trade Organization and the International Court of Justice. Now, in the normal run of things, I would perhaps say that there isn't any change as a consequence of Brexit. But unfortunately, that's not true. Because as a result of Brexit, the UK now has a diminished role in some of these institutions. It was reported a year or two ago that for the first time ever, a UK judge is no longer sitting in the International Criminal Court. In terms of the World Trade Organization rules, the UK had previously used the EU as the way to exert influence there. The UK now needs to stand alone within the WTO, and in that the UK has struggled to exert influence. It is seen as a smaller player to many of the other bigger players that compose the WTO. So in that regards, Brexit has reduced the UK's influence politically when it comes to institutions. Of course, that is not the only way that the UK or any country can influence others politically. A lot of times this will be done in embassies and consulates and so on. And traditionally the UK has been very strong here, and this should be no exception. However, what we have seen as a result of Brexit is a reconfiguring of UK Foreign Office influence towards trade, rather than traditional, more traditional diplomatic initiatives. It's also rather bizarrely, in this time of significant international change for the UK government has decided that the UK should have less diplomats. I have no idea of the logic behind this. It seems very counterproductive. But either way, in British embassies and consulates around the world, the future looks like less professional diplomats, more trade missions, and judging by some of the stories I've read about the visa scandals and so on, or the delays in processing visas, more contractors sitting at embassies. And the thing I want to emphasise here is that contractors never have the same legal status as diplomatic staff. Therefore, they have no influence in that country whatsoever. So in this regard, again, we're perhaps seeing a small decline in UK influence. Now, the next category is obviously very important, treaties. Treaties are a very important means by which countries exert political influence, build relationship, and secure what is in their self-interest, or enlightened self-interest. So there's a few obvious examples here to talk about. First, free trade agreements. Now normally free trade agreements should be sitting in the economic section, not in the political section. But as I've covered in a previous video, the British government doesn't use free trade agreements as vehicles for generating economic return for the UK economy. It uses them solely as political instruments as a bid to try and prove that Brexit was a success. So simply put, the UK government is agreeing a whole load of terrible trade agreements for no other reason than to look good and to try and build relationship and to promote political cooperation, shall we say. The British government is not using them in the way that they're normally used by most other nations. As a consequence of that, the UK is seen as lowering the standards for free trade agreements, and in many ways the countries are openly pointing out that they are benefiting from that. Australia and New Zealand are classic examples where their media have openly talked about the fact that they got the better end of the deal. So again, in this respect, it is not having the political impact that the Brexiteers and the UK government is hoping for. Quite the opposite, in fact. The UK has been seen as less credible because the UK is not willing to devote the time and effort to agreeing proper trade agreements. So again, this indicates a decline in UK influence. Now I wanted to talk about AUKUS briefly because this perhaps is an exception maybe to the rule on treaties, in that here the UK has supposedly secured a significant treaty, a significant alliance with the US and with Australia. Now this generated a lot of attention at the time. Very specifically, the deal rather angered France. And this is because the French government had, several years before, agreed what they termed as the defence deal of the history with the Australian government, and that was to build submarines. So in agreeing to AUKUS, the Australian government welched on the deal with the French, and the US and the UK were seen as complicit in that. But what is very telling is that when the French government voiced its anger and sanctioned the Australians and the US, or protested, I perhaps should say, rather than sanctioned, especially in the current climate, but when it protested, the French didn't bother doing anything with the UK. And the point was very much made that the French, A, considered the UK the junior partner in this, and B, considered applying any protest to the UK completely pointless. As they put it, they expected the UK to be totally untrustworthy. They didn't expect any better, and so there was no point complaining about it, which is actually quite a diplomatic insult in a way. So what that represents, perhaps in its own visual way, is that other countries simply do not see the UK as the main partner anymore. In this particular case, it was very much the US. And we're seeing hints of that in a whole variety of other agreements. The UK is there, the UK is an influence. The UK has traditionally been a very strong influence. But that seems to be a little bit on the wane at this point in time. Coupled with the terrible free trade agreements and the rather ludicrous foreign policy objectives perhaps pursued by the UK government in many respects, other nations do not take the UK credibly when it comes to treaties. And here we come to the most stunning failure in terms of the treaties. And I called it the Northern Ireland Protocol, but of course really it should be the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and all the bits associated with that. This has been a monumental failure for the UK government. There has been lots of UK press about Northern Ireland Protocol and the threat to trigger Article 16. But the reality is that the UK has lost the argument, completely and utterly been trounced by the EU. The EU had roped in allies. We've got obviously 27 member states to support it. It's got the US to support it. So even now, of all the times, Boris Johnson is still going around trying to drum up support from other nations for the UK position on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And all those other nations are just politely changing the subject. They're not interested in talking about it. And the reason being, well, it's twofold. One, they don't see it as, as an issue worth talking about. That is the UK's problem to deal with, with the EU. And the second, they think the UK is lost. It's a non-issue. So, but what it has served is to demonstrate just how untrustworthy the UK is when it comes to agreeing international agreements right now. So the continued UK posture on the Northern Ireland Protocol is doing the UK considerable international harm across the world. And of course, the final thing worth mentioning are meetings. The UK is part of the G20, the G7, and a whole host of other international fora and conventions. And the UK even did host the G7. But what was very striking about that was just how bad-tempered it seemed. Even though the UK were the hosts, the other countries, particularly the likes of Germany, France and the US, were very conspicuous in not being interested in what the UK had to say. And even in a recent trip to Europe, President Biden visited NATO. There's a big NATO conference there, which Boris Johnson did attend. But he was snubbed quite publicly, and this was widely reported in the European press. The UK was also not invited to the follow-up security meetings. So there are massive discussions happening on the global stage about international security as a result of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and the UK is not even being invited to those meetings to be represented properly. And that tells you something. So when it comes to political influence in the UK, the verdict is that Brexit has been hugely damaging. Let's look at the next one. Now, economic influence is important. And the UK, of course, is one of the Tier 1 economic powers. And this has conveyed considerable influence to the UK in the past. Now I know, let's get the obvious bit out of the way. The UK economy has not been doing great recently. Not many other countries, many other economies have had a difficult time of late. So the argument that COVID and supply chain problems have affected the UK economy is true, but they've affected all the other economies as well. So the question then becomes, has the UK recovered comparably to how the other economies have recovered? And unfortunately, the statistics here, the figures are rather stark, which is that the UK has not. So for starters, the UK, as a result of leaving the EU and erecting trade barriers, and of course having no genuinely sensible free trade agreement with the rest of the world, the cost for the UK of manufacturing stuff has increased dramatically. So food prices, which have now to be imported from abroad, has increased. UK farmers cannot grow as many crops because they cannot get the labour in from Europe that they used to be able to. That has increased the cost of UK food. Goods coming into UK factories to be manufactured, many of them sourced from outside the UK, whether from Europe or the rest of the world. The cost of importing them has all increased. Some of this is a general worldwide increase, but other parts are simply due to the way the UK now has to operate within the framework of trade barriers that it has erected as a consequence of leaving the EU. So what this has really meant is that although many countries in the world are suffering a cost of living crisis, an increased cost across the board, for the UK this is even more acute. And we can see this by the fact that the UK cannot even access cheap labour, which its economy depended upon, because of the way that it treats labour coming into the country. So generally speaking, the outlook for the UK economy is not looking good, and the confidence in the UK economy had really dropped markedly. Now, it's very hard particularly to prove this, but there are certain indicators, and I know I previously said commentators don't rely too much on certain statistics, so we have to treat them with caution. But there are some statistics worth looking at. An obvious one, which is pretty credible and really tells the picture very clearly, is the immediate 14% drop in UK exports. Now, people might think that 14% doesn't sound too much, but for an economy like the UK, global export is absolutely critical to the UK economy. The UK economy imports and exports far more than many countries do. So a 14% drop represents a massive decline in UK output as a consequence. That is why that figure is so significant. And the UK's Office for National Statistics has officially declared, and it has been done robustly analysed, and I know many people would like to try and discredit this, but at the end of the day, they're the professionals, we are not, and many economists agree with this assessment. But as a consequence of all the Brexit policies, the result to the UK economy is a minus 4% of GDP annually, every single year. Now, of course, we have to be cautious. A whole host of things can change to alter. But the current trajectory, the UK, no matter what it does, is going to be 4% poorer than when it first went into, when it first left the EU as a result of various Brexit policies. Just also for anyone who wished to re-quote the lie from the government that the UK is the fastest growing economy, it is not. That was true for perhaps 1 month, and that was because the UK had fallen faster than all the other economies because it got hit by COVID, supply chain problems and Brexit barriers all at the same time. So there was a bit of an elastic band effect of the UK economy rebounding, but by any international measure, or any credible international measure that you care to use, the UK is lagging behind all the other economies when it comes to recovering from COVID. And no doubt that will continue with all the economic consequences of the war in Ukraine. So it is very significant that within all of this, all the costs have increased, exports have decreased. There's also been a significant decline in investment by foreign investors into the UK. And unfortunately, we can't count all those Russian oligarchs. Their investment is obviously either frozen or fled, and perhaps not the sort of investment the UK should have been seeking, arguably. And we can see that one of the consequences of all this is a rather significant decline in the London financial market. The London financial market is massive, and it's still dominant, but it's not as dominant as it was. And that same outlook can be applied to any other area of the UK economy that was previously dominant. A very similar picture across the board. Everything is going down, essentially, with a few exceptions. So I'm trying to find a positive. What has Brexit done that is actually beneficial to the UK economy? And there's only one thing I can think of, and that is increased employment. And I always said there would be increased employment as a consequence of Brexit, because of course if you shut out all the immigration and all the other people that would come in and fill in the jobs, then of course you immediately create more jobs. And of course the UK government has created more customs jobs, shall we say, people that process all the trade barrier paperwork. So that's the one benefit that I can think of Brexit when it comes to economically. for absolutely anything else you care to look at, it is, well, quite frankly, a disaster. It looks terrible. By no measure that any credible economist can find can we say that the UK economy is doing well. And whilst I always caution that over-reliant on GDP figures, you shouldn't do that because there's all sorts of issues with it. What we can see is a general trend. So not only a decline in GDP figures, a decline in purchasing power, a decline in consumer confidence, a decline in living standards, a decline in life expectancy. Across the board, everything looks terrible. And in many ways, this is linked to the economic issues that the UK now has. So let's move to the next stage. Let's talk about scientific and cultural power. A bit more of a softly type thing. It's hard to define in many ways, hard to put numbers on this sort of thing. But there are some things we do know. We do know that the UK is no longer part of the EU scientific corporations. Now, this was very significantly the UK's choice. The UK government decided that just because it was funded or supported by the EU, the UK should have no part in it, even though the UK had already paid to be a part of it. This is what the whole divorce bill sort of argument was about, that the UK was meant to meet its funding contribution and receive the benefits of the projects that it was involved in. But the UK government insisted that all of that should be pulled ahead of completion of the project simply because it was associated with the EU. So as a consequence of that, UK science is no longer involved. And even after that, when new projects start up, no one particularly wants to invite the UK to join either. So what this means is something that was, and still is, very much a strength for the UK. The UK scientific and technology base is very significant. That is now on a path of decline because it can no longer has access to EU funding. So the UK does actually have to go elsewhere. But where else can it go? Because funding is going down. EU funding that used to go into the UK had not been replaced by UK government funding. The UK government had not really opened up any relationship with outside of the world EU scientific streams. Inside Europe scientific research, which is an extremely strong environment, I don't know whether it's second or rival. We're certainly rivaling the US. So the UK is now, scientifically speaking, between two great big sort of walled gardens, not really able to access either. So this is going to harm the UK technology base. As time goes on, that harm will get worse or more obvious. And we're talking a bit more about the cultural side of things and not only the scientific side of things. But the UK made it much harder for people to get visas. Of course, in the EU, you didn't need visas at all to travel in the EU. So, not only that scientists can't travel and freely exchange ideas, which is so beneficial to scientific progress, and same for companies as well, by the way, for similar reasons, but even musicians and artists can no longer travel to or from the UK with ease like they used to. And I know those exemptions, but there's a whole pile of hassle, and let's be honest, if you're an artist and musician, then probably paperwork is not your strong point. So that has led to a decline in UK cultural influence abroad. And also in some ways it can lead to a more insular UK society as less foreign musicians and artists come into the UK than they used to be. And this is a very subtle and hard to pin down numerically type of thing, but those sorts of exchanges are important. They're important for building relationships, for building understanding and tolerance even. So the question then arises, if the UK society as a result of these increased barriers is going to become more insular, more intolerant of foreigners due to less exposure. And likewise, particularly in Europe, will they become less interested and less tolerant of the UK because they no longer have those cultural influences coming to visit as regularly as they used to? That is a question that I do not have the answer to. But I can definitely, not hard to speculate, that this is going to be harmful for the ability of the UK to exert that sort of influence. Look at Hollywood in the US. Hollywood is a massive export. It's a massive influence to how people perceive the UK. And influence in countries is a very odd thing. It's a very specific thing. You might mention the Swiss. The Swiss influence the world through banking, chocolate, cuckoo clocks maybe. The Italians influence the world with their designer shoes and suits and so on. Those are perhaps, and pizza or whatever. Those are perhaps cultural influences that so happen to have economic benefits for Italy. But they're still cultural influences. And so the question arises that now that the UK has put up so many barriers, will those cultural exchanges decrease? And what will be the political, financial, economic harm that will result to the UK, as well as the changes in outlook? And we're starting to see some early signs of this, because internationally, for those who care to look at international media, newspapers and so on, you might be perhaps UK or British citizen, maybe certainly not those outside, will be rather shocked to realise just how mocked the UK is right now. Foreign media, foreign politicians, if they want to scare their electorate into not voting for stupid things, like leaving the EU, will say, well, look at the UK. Look how badly it has gone for them. Look how terrible, look at the terrible consequences that they are suffering as a result of those decisions. They are literally mocking the UK decision and UK Brexit publicly, because it's a very easy target for them, the same way it is a very easy target for professional negotiators like me when teaching courses on how to negotiate internationally. And perhaps the final two things I want to mention in this section is that the UK government's obsession with being anti-immigration is causing immense harm. Not just economic harm in that we can no longer attract the workforce that we used to, but also moral harm. Other countries, particularly in Europe, but not just Europe, are looking at how badly the UK are treating immigrants, including Ukrainian immigrants, by the way. And the UK is losing any moral credibility as a consequence of that. And that is very damning. That is a terrible outlook, it's a terrible judgment on the UK as a public perception, if you like, and an outward expression of what kind of country the UK is. Because it's not the reality of the UK. I live in the UK. I can promise you, the UK is not like that. But unfortunately, the UK government is. And as a consequence of that, UK foreign policy is, quite frankly, racist and anti-immigration. And deliberately so. Deliberate barriers. And as a result of that sort of moral vacuum, even what should be success stories, for example, the UK COVID vaccine, the AstraZeneca jab, that should have been a success story. The UK should have been able to exert scientific and cultural influence by giving that vaccine to the world, by helping to inoculate the poorest societies in the world. And we hear nothing of that anymore. And so those grand dreams, those lofty ambitions that Matt Hancock had, lie in tatters now, because even what should have been a success has been a failure as a consequence of monumental government incompetence. So in the roundup to scientific and cultural impact of Brexit, I would say very much on a downwards trajectory, possibly going to get worse later. So having said all of that, and I'm conscious this is perhaps quite a long video, I'm no doubt there'll be people saying, can I think of anything positive to say about the impact of Brexit on the UK's ability, on the UK's influence abroad? And the answer is, I cannot think of a single damn thing. And I deal with many international people. That is what my job is. And I have to reassure them that I am there, that I'm credible, and that any promises that I make are credible. I shouldn't have to do that. I didn't used to have to do that. So there's nothing I can look at, whether it's, politically or economic or scientific or anything, that Brexit has touched that has not caused harm. There are no benefits whatsoever. And the UK government and the media are spinning this as much as possible. They're blaming COVID, they're blaming the pandemic, they're blaming the Ukraine war. And whilst there's some grounds of truth in that those events had an impact, the reality is that all the wider impact, all the deeper problem that the UK now faces, all lead back to Brexit, which is not a cheerful thought. So what can I say in conclusion? Well, I'm not really old enough to have seen the fall of the British Empire, but of course I've read quite a bit about it in the history books, and I kind of feel that right now the UK is going through a period of hyper decline. Events are going down so much faster than they would have done in the past. The British Empire took several years, perhaps even decades arguably, to fully decline. We are seeing that happen in a matter of a few years. The decline started immediately after the referendum result, when people decided that perhaps the UK was not a good place to invest. That decline is accelerating and continuing to accelerate as various UK industries are being demolished, underfunded, falling apart, or even just being offshored. The London financial district is a classic example. Many of those jobs, many of those companies have simply moved abroad. So the UK, as a sort of industrial, economic, scientific powerhouse, that is in decline right now at a speed that has not been seen before, not been seen for a long time. So really what perhaps negotiators such as myself can draw from this, the lesson we can draw, is just how important it is for any country in the world to have partnerships, to have friendships, to have good agreements with nations that are robust and stand scrutiny and the test of time. And Brexit had really shown up just how important these things are. The only other events that have really demonstrated how important this is as well is the Ukraine war. So right now, Russia is learning the harsh and painful lesson that even if you are a powerful country with a powerful military, one of the most powerful militaries in the world, if you don't have those international partnerships, if you don't have that proper influence in international institutions, an agreement, with friends and allies that you can call upon, then you don't have much power internationally at all, really. No matter how wealthy you are, no matter how much oil, gas, other resources you may have. A group of international countries can turn on you easily and make you suffer. So really, this leads me to the final conclusion, that Brexit is not the worst idea ever. What Russia is doing in Ukraine perhaps beats the UK in Brexit very solidly in that respect. The issue for Brexit is not only whether that is a bad idea, it was terribly implemented, and the job was given to the worst people in the world to ask to deliver such a complicated programme. Now I could talk about certain things that perhaps Brexit could have delivered that could have been beneficial. So for example, the UK would not have been beholden to the EU CAP, Common Agricultural Policy. And so the UK could have done a better policy of funding its agriculture than currently exists in the EU. But it was a political decision by the UK government not to do that. In the same way as a political decision by the UK government not to help UK citizens with the cost of living crisis, not to fund healthcare properly, not to do a whole host of things properly, quite frankly. And those are the arguments about the domestic issues with Brexit. I'll save that for another video. But in terms of all the international impact of Brexit, anything that a professional like myself looks at just looks terrible. There are no positives, there are no upsides. Maybe in time they will come up, but right here and right now the future looks awfully bleak, and I really do hope things turn around, because this is just far too depressing. So this is one of the dangers of being a negotiator. It's a bit too easy to be negative. It's a bit too easy to see all the problem, because that is part of the training. That's part of what we do. We try and find the problems, spot them early, so that we can develop solutions for them and head them off. So I do have to remind myself that sometimes, to try and think of the positive side of any situation. But on this one, it is just incredibly difficult to do. And I think you really have to be rather absorbed in the wrong news outlets to not even realise just how badly things are going. So I hope you found this video useful. If anyone can generally think of provable international benefit to the UK or Brexit, rather than perhaps benefits that have arisen nothing to do with Brexit, then please do comment below the video. I'd be really interested to see that. And I look forward to seeing any of the comments in the video blocks below. Please do like and subscribe to this content if you'd like to see more of it.